I was standing behind a man in a hobby shop who was explaining the Vigilus campaign to someone who'd never heard of it, and he was doing a good job. He had the enthusiasm of somebody describing a war he'd personally survived. He said Vigilus was the story that defined 8th edition, that it was where the Imperium finally understood what the Great Rift had cost it, that it was the campaign where everything came together. Then he listed what happened, in order. The Orks arrived first, then the Genestealer Cults rose up. Then the new Space Marines showed up on a neighbouring world. Then Abaddon came in person, and I stood there and realized he had just recited Games Workshop's product release calendar for the winter of 2018, item by item, in the exact order the boxes went on sale, and he had no idea that's what he'd done. He wasn't wrong about any of it. That's what stayed with me. Every event he described did happen in the lore, in that sequence, for reasons the books explain. He'd simply never been given a reason to notice that the sequence was determined somewhere other than the story. So this is a catalogue of everything new that the Vigilus campaign introduced to Warhammer 40,000, and it's also an argument about where that new material came from. I'm going to show you how legibly the plot of this war maps onto the release schedule that ran alongside it, and then I'm going to show you the one piece of Vigilus lore that broke the pattern completely, sold nothing at all, and turned out to be the only part that mattered. Before any of that, the ledger, because this subject has a specific hazard attached to it. Vigilus was a flagship war zone. It ran across 2 editions and at least 6 books. And there is, as far as I have been able to verify, no Black Library novel set on it. Not one. Everything canonical about Vigilus lives in Games Workshop campaign books and codices, which are corporate authored and carry no writer's name on the cover. There were short stories published free on the Warhammer community website alongside the campaign, collected under the banner Tales from Vigilus, and there was material in White Dwarf. I could not verify the authors of those short stories, so I'm not going to name anyone. If you hear someone cite the Vigilus novel, ask them which one, because I couldn't find it. The books this is drawn from are these: Imperium Nihilus, Vigilus Defiant, a Games Workshop campaign book for 8th edition, published December 2018, Imperium Nihilus, Vigilus Ablaze, 8th edition, March 2019, Shadowspear, a boxed set containing a campaign book, 8th edition, March 2019, Warzone Nachmund, Vigilus Alone, 9th edition, 2022, Warzone Nachmund, Rift War, 9th edition, 2022, and Arcs of Omen, Abaddon, 9th edition, January 2023. Those are the sources. Where they contradict each other, I'll say so rather than pick the version that sounds better. Start with the planet itself, because the setting is the part that was genuinely invented rather than assembled. Vigilus is a hive world in the Nachmund sector of Segmentum Obscurus, and the first thing the books establish about it is that it's dry, not poetically dry, administratively dry. Water on Vigilus is stratified by class in a way that's specified down to the source. The planetary nobility drink water melted from icebergs hauled down from the polar wastes of Kalax's Bane. Everyone else drinks reclaimed water pulled up from underground. The campaign book builds a whole society on that single distinction, and it's the kind of detail that doesn't sell a model. Nobody has ever bought a kit because of Vigilus's water table. The planet is divided into hivesprawls rather than hive cities, each shielded behind bastion-class void shields, and the campaign gives you around a dozen named regions with functions. Hyperia is the largest sprawl and the seat of planetary government. Otek and Dirkden were both eventually classified as lost. Saints Haven is the seat of the ruling Agamonus dynasty. Mega Borealis is an entire continent that was signed over wholesale to the Adeptus Mechanicus 1,000 years before the war under an agreement called the Pact of Fire and Steel, in exchange for the Mechanicus and its allied knight houses contributing to planetary defense. By the time of the campaign, that continent has been strip-mined nearly to exhaustion. Storval is volcanic and supplies the planet's power. The Hollows are 5 vast reservoirs, and in the east there's a city made of crashed warship wreckage called Fort Dakar, which is not imperial at all. The political structure is a 3-way balance called the Acolarian Council, split between the Agamemnus dynasty, the Mechanicus and the Ecclesiarchy. So before a shot is fired, Vigilus has a governing body with 3 competing interests: a continent owned by a foreign power, a class system organized around drinking water, and a mining industry running out of things to mine. That's a setting. Hold on to how much of it exists, because we're going to come back to how little of it gets used. Now the stakes, which are the single most important thing the campaign introduced. When the Great Rift tore open at the end of the 13th Black Crusade, it split the Imperium into Imperium Sanctus, the half that can still see terror, and Imperium Nihilus, the half that can't. The Vigilus books establish that the Nachmund Gauntlet is one of only 2 confirmed stable, navigable passages through that rift, and that Vigilus sits at its mouth. The mechanism is specific, and it's new. There are spears of Blackstone embedded in the crust of Vigilus, and matching spears embedded in the crust of a paired world called Sangua Terra, whose spears always point toward Vigilus. Between those 2 worlds, the polarized Blackstone generates an anti-empiric field, and that field physically pushes back the warp storms trying to close the corridor from both sides. The gauntlet is not a lucky gap. It's held open by 2 planets acting as bookends. That makes Vigilus the doorway between the 2 halves of the Imperium. It's how Terra reinforces Nihilus at all. It's the funnel that billions of refugees flee through. And it gives Abaddon a strategic objective that isn't conquest. He doesn't need to take Vigilus. He needs to break the Blackstone, let the storms close in, and strand half of the Imperium on the far side of a wall permanently. That is a genuinely excellent premise, and I want to be fair to it before I start taking the campaign apart. Somebody thought hard about that. It gave the post-Rift galaxy a physical choke point, where previously it had only an abstraction, and it did it with a single idea about 2 planets and a mineral. Then October of 2018 happened. In that month, Games Workshop released a boxed game called Speed Freeks. It contained orc buggies, shock jump dragstars, custom booster blasters, vehicles built around the idea of orcs racing each other across open ground. It was a good box. It was also, explicitly, set on Vigilus. Now look at how the war begins in Vigilus Defiant 2 months later. The Great Rift opens, warp storms wash over the planet, and the Bastion-class void shields protecting each hivesprawl fail. An orc armada is spat out of the rift, punches through the orbital defenses, and crash lands in the deserts between the sprawls. And then the orcs discover that the cities are protected by force fields they can't easily breach, so instead of besieging them, they turn to the open desert, and the stranded fleet reinvents itself as something called the Speed War. Read that sequence again with the release date in your hand. The orcs arrive by crashing, which puts them outside the cities. The cities are then established as unassaultable, which keeps them outside the cities, and the open desert between the sprawls, which the planet's geography has thoughtfully provided, becomes the arena. A big mech called Cruel Daka then performs the act the book describes as Purist Kunin, which is breaching the fort walls that divide the planet's regions in order to open racing routes across the entire surface. The single most consequential orc action in the opening act of this war is the creation of a racetrack. That is the plot of a racing game, told backwards, from the miniatures outward. And the Speed War, which had previously been a flavor of orc behavior, gets formalized into a doctrine with a name. In the same season, the buggies went on sale in October of 2018. There's a second orc in this story who deserves more attention than he gets, and he makes the same point from a different direction. Alongside Cruel Daka at Fort Daka, there's a Death Skull's big mech called Zogbag, who holds a domain called Gork's Landing, and Zogbag's distinction is that he was the first on the planet to start building Stompus and Gargants, the enormous orc war engines, and that hundreds more followed from his works. So the orc presence on Vigilus is split into 2 named centers with 2 named leaders and 2 entirely different specialities. One builds fast things, one builds huge things. That's a well-organized faction. It's also a product range with a light kit and a heavy kit, described in Universe. November of 2018 produced Blackstone Fortress, a boxed exploration game, which introduced a set of models called the Gellerpox Infected. Gellerpox forces subsequently show up in the Vigilus incursions. I want to be careful here, because I could confirm the Gellerpox on Vigilus, but I could not confirm how Games Workshop narratively connected those 2 properties, so treat the link as unverified rather than established. December of 2018 is where the pattern becomes difficult to unsee. Vigilus Defiant arrives as a 200-page hardback, and it isn't only lore, it's the first campaign book of a new type, setting material, plus a full 3-phase campaign system, plus 22 specialist detachments. A specialist detachment is a named fighting style for a specific army, with its own rules, 22 of them, and the roster of factions present in the story of Vigilus is the roster of armies those 22 detachments were written for. The Orks are there. So are the Genestealer Cults, and the Ultramarines, and the Sisters of Battle across 5 named orders. Styges VIII represents the Adeptus Mechanicus, which is why that continent got signed over 1,000 years ago. Imperial Knights arrive from House Terran and House Sablus. The Astra Militarum fields the Vigilant Guard. Add the Death Guard, the Black Legion, Drukhari raiding out of an ancient webway gate in the frozen north, and the craft world Eldari of Saim Han arriving to deliver a warning. Every one of those factions has a reason to be on Vigilus, and every one of those reasons is well constructed. But the question isn't whether the reasons are good. The question is which came first, the roster or the reasons, and the answer is legible in the page count because the detachments and the lore are in the same 200-page book. There's a way to test that claim, and the test is to look for the factions that got rules out of Vigilus but didn't get a story. The World Eaters are the clearest case. Vigilus Ablaze gave them substantial rules support, and they're present on the planet as roving Khorne Berserker warbands. Their narrative role, as far as I can verify across the campaign books, is close to nothing. They arrive, they're violent, that's the account. I went looking specifically for Khan the Betrayer on Vigilus, because if you're giving the World Eaters a rules push you'd expect their most famous character to turn up, and I could not verify a narrative account of him being there at all. Rules coverage, yes. A scene, no. So I'm not going to tell you Khan fought on Vigilus, because I can't show you where. Then look at the reverse case, the factions that had every strategic reason to be there and simply aren't. The campaign's entire premise is that Vigilus is the most valuable piece of real estate in the galaxy, the gate between the two halves of a sundered Imperium. The Tor never appear, the Necrons never appear. 2 of the setting's major powers ignore the most strategically important world in the setting, and no book I found explains why. Unless the roster was never really about strategic value, in which case it explains itself. The Tau and the Necrons didn't have a release window that winter. There's also a detail in that list worth stopping on. The Tyranids get mentioned. Hive fleets are described as having been sighted making for Vigilus, and then, as far as I can verify across every subsequent book, nothing happens. They never become a front in this war. That thread is still hanging, 7 years later. Late in 2018, Games Workshop released a character model for a new named Chaos Lord called Haarken Worldclaimer, Herald of the Apocalypse and Proclamator of Abaddon's reign. He's a Raptor Lord, which means he's a jump pack character, which means he attacks from above, and in Vigilus Ablaze, Haarken's contribution to the war is that he assaults the hive spires from the top down with cohorts of raptors, warp talons and helldrakes. He also publicly declares that Vigilus will fall in 80 days, which is exactly the kind of specific, quotable, marketing-shaped boast that a new character needs in order to establish himself. The lore built around him is genuinely good, incidentally. He carries a weapon called the Hellspear and proclaims worlds dead by driving it into their surface. His flagship is the Herald of Damnation. He's an occult scholar who has read the Grimoire Nostromo of Conrad Kurtz, the Clotted Scrolls of Angron, and the Book of Magnus, and the books state plainly that this cost him his sanity. That's a character. But the shape of his role in the war is the shape of his model, and the shape of his model is a jump pack. Calgar's response to him is the detail I keep returning to. To deny Haarken the spires, Marneus Calgar burns them down and topples them himself. The commander defending the planet destroys the planet's cities to keep them out of enemy hands. January and February of 2019 brought Codex Genestealer Cults for 8th edition, released on the 8th of February, alongside a large new model range. And the second phase of the Vigilus campaign is the Genestealer Cult Uprising. The books give it a 2-century backstory, a clutch of Genestealers sent to Vigilus by an existing cult, one survivor reaching the caverns beneath Megaborealis, and over roughly 200 years, that survivor becoming a patriarch called Grandsire Worm, whose brood infiltrates upward through Vigilant society until it reaches the Aquilarian Council itself. Note the timing inside the fiction though. The uprising is described as premature. The cult didn't rise because it was ready. It rose because the Ork rampage forced its hand, which is to say, the cult's plot is triggered by the previous product's plot, in a sequence that matches the order the products were released, and the lore supplies an in-universe reason for the timing. Marneus Calgar arrives around this point, dispatched after a dream vision carried by the astral projection of Chief Librarian Tigurius bearing Guilliman's order that Vigilus must not fall. Guilliman appoints him supreme commander of all Imperial forces on the planet. Calgar goes to Saints Haven, meets the Aquilarian Council, senses the cult's taint on the bureaucrats, and has his marines execute them where they stand. He dissolves the 1,000-year-old three-way government and replaces it with a body called the Vigilus Senate. That three-way political balance the campaign book spent pages establishing, the dynasty and the Mechanicus and the ecclesiarchy, the pact of fire and steel, the continent signed away a millennium ago. It exists for about one act, and then a space marine shoots it. March of 2019 is the densest month, and it's where I think the argument stops being circumstantial. Games Workshop released Shadowspear, a boxed set with 35 miniatures. On the Imperial side it introduced Vanguard Space Marines, Infiltrators, Eliminators, Suppressors, and Phobos armored characters. That's not one kit. That's an entire covert operations branch of the Primaris Marines, arriving at once. On the Chaos side it introduced the Master of Possession, the Greater Possessed, the Venom Crawler, new Obliterators, and a new Chaos Space Marine kit. Also an entire sub-faction, arriving at once. 2 brand new ranges, in one box, needing somewhere to fight. And the campaign book inside Shadowspear introduces a world that had not previously mattered, Nemendgast, an industrial world on the outskirts of the Vigilus system, ringed by mineral-rich asteroids. A Black Legion Master of Possession called Vorash Soulflayer, appointed directly by Abaddon, has seized its forges, above all one called the Forge Infernus, and is converting the entire world into a factory producing daemon engines, Daemonkin, and a new class of artifact called Noctilith Crowns. Calgar's response is to dispatch Strikeforce Shadowspear, made up of Vanguard Marines from the Ultramarines 2nd Company under Captain Sevastus Acheron, to infiltrate the planet. They fail to kill Vorash. They succeed in disabling the Forge Infernus. A survivor escapes to carry the warning home. So a new world is introduced, and its defining characteristic is that it is a factory for exactly the Chaos units in the box, and the mission sent against it is a covert infiltration, which is exactly what the Imperial units in the box are built to do. The war zone was created to give the product a stage, and both halves of the product are the cast. I want to give Shadowspear its due though, because buried inside that transparently commercial exercise is one of the campaign's genuinely new pieces of lore, and it isn't the war zone. The Vanguard Marines aren't a unit, they're a doctrine. Phobos pattern armor, infiltration, reconnaissance, sniping, suppression, an entire covert operations branch of the Primaris Marines, arriving with its own operational logic in a faction previously defined by walking at the enemy in ceramite and shooting them. That's a real addition to how the Adeptus Astartes work, and it has outlasted Vigilus completely. Every Phobos unit fielded since 2019 traces back to that box. The Chaos half is the same story. The Daemonkin, Black Legion warbands defined by the fusion of daemon, machine and flesh, get an origin point in this campaign, and that origin point is industrial. Vorash Soulflayer isn't summoning them one at a time. He has taken an industrial world and turned its forges into a production line, and the Forge Infernus is a factory. That's a genuinely unsettling idea, that daemon engines have a supply chain, and it came out of Vigilus. So the pattern isn't that commercially driven lore is worthless. It's that commercially driven lore is inconsistent. The same box that invented a disposable war zone also introduced 2 things still in use 7 years later. The same month brought a second version of Codex, Chaos Space Marines for 8th edition, and Vigilus Ablaze, and with them the Lord Discordant model and the Noctilith Crown terrain kit. And in the story, this is the month Abaddon the Despoiler personally arrives at the head of a vast Chaos fleet, with the Vengeful Spirit taking up orbit as his command center. Noctilith crowns are raised across the surface of Vigilus, driven in on long steel spikes at sites the Masters of Possession identify as geomantically significant. The Noctilith crown is a plot-critical superweapon and a piece of scenery you could buy that week. It is doing both jobs simultaneously, and it is not hiding it. 2 more pieces of the roster deserve a moment, because they're the ones doing the most interesting work at the edges. The Drukhari raid Vigilus out of an ancient Aeldari webway gate in the western reaches of Kalak's Bane, the frozen northern wasteland where the nobility's ice is mined. The Cabal of the Black Heart is named as prominent, and what they do with that access is specific and grim. They hit Kalak's Bane, Otek and Dirkden, and they annihilate refugee flotillas to haul captives back to Camorra. Remember that Vigilus is the funnel billions of refugees are fleeing through. The Drukhari aren't fighting for the planet, they've found a queue. I looked for a named Drukhari Archon commanding those raids, and couldn't verify one, which tells you roughly how much narrative weight the raids were given. The craft world Aldari of Saimhan do something stranger. They send emissaries to warn of a doom to come, which is standard Aeldari behavior, and then, at the climax, an Aeldari vessel is what forces Abaddon to break off from killing Calgar. Their motive isn't the Imperium, it's the corridor. The gauntlet matters to them for their own reasons, and the books don't fully explain what those reasons are. And the Adepta Sororitas are on Vigilus in force, across 5 named orders: our Martyred Lady, the Bloody Rose, the Ebon Chalice, the Argent Shroud and the Last Prioress, with Temperance Blaze commanding our Martyred Lady, concentrated at Hyperia and fighting in Otek. Saint Celestine herself appears during the War of Nightmares to rally the defenders. I'd flag that Celestine's Vigilus appearance is attested on the wikis, but I couldn't tie it to a specific book, so hold it loosely. 5 orders is a lot of sisters for a campaign in which their most consequential contribution arrives 3 years later, in a supplement. Here's where I should say the obvious thing, since we're most of the way through the catalogue. None of this makes the story bad, and I'm not building toward telling you that you were wrong to enjoy it. Everything I've described is well made. The water politics, Haarken's ruined mind, Calgar burning his own spires, a patriarch growing in the dark under a strip-mined continent for 2 centuries, that's good writing under commercial constraint, which is most writing. Films get made because a studio owns a location. Television seasons run the length the network bought. Knowing the shape of the constraint doesn't make the work fraudulent, it makes it legible. What it does change is which parts last. Lore written to give a model a home tends to have exactly the lifespan of the model's marketing window. Lore written because somebody needed the setting to work differently tends to outlive everything around it. Once you can tell those 2 apart on sight, you stop being surprised when a war zone that was sold as the hinge of an era quietly stops being mentioned. And Vigilus has 1 piece of the second kind in it. Before that, the last of the first kind, because it happens 3 years later, and it's the clearest example in the whole campaign. In 2022, 9th edition, Games Workshop published Warzone Nachmund, Vigilus Alone, a 96-page hardback. In the fiction, Calgar leaves Vigilus without making it clear to anyone left behind that he survived his duel with Abaddon. The planet concludes he's dead. A martyr cult forms around his supposed sacrifice, and the shattered survivors, Space Marine remnants, Adepta Sororitas, Astra Militarum, fuse together into something the book calls an army of faith, built on that cult, with the Order of the Bloody Rose foregrounded. That book was released as a supplement supporting a Sororitas order and a Vanguard Spearhead army list. The narrative reason that Sisters of Battle and Space Marines are fighting shoulder to shoulder as a single formation is a martyr cult that formed around a man who isn't dead, and the rules reason is that somebody wanted to field Sisters and Marines in one list. I find that one almost admirable in its efficiency. The commercial requirement and the emotional beat are the same object. Before the exception, 1 more release, because it's the one that shows the machinery running in reverse. The Vigilus campaign didn't only generate lore to justify models, it also generated a rules format. Vigilus Defiant was the first Games Workshop campaign book of its particular type, setting material, plus a structured 3-phase campaign system you could actually play through across 6 rounds, plus those 22 specialist detachments. That format was new, and it worked, and it became the template for how Games Workshop published narrative campaigns afterwards. Which means Vigilus's most durable contribution to the hobby might not be a place or a character at all, it might be a book format. I find that genuinely funny, and I mean that without malice. A campaign about a planet holding open the only door between two halves of a sundered galaxy, and one of the things it's most reliably remembered for is the way the supplement was laid out. Now the exception of everything the Vigilus campaign introduced, one idea sold nothing. There is no Nachmund Gauntlet kit. You cannot buy polarized Blackstone. There is no model for a stable warp corridor. It is pure setting mechanics, and it is the only part of this campaign still doing structural work in the setting today. Before Vigilus, the Great Rift was framed as near total separation. Gathering Storm and the material around Dark Imperium in 2017 presented Imperium Nihilus as cut off, dark, unreachable, a half of the galaxy in shadow. Vigilus revised that. 2 stable passages, one of them named, mapped and given a gatekeeper world. That materially changes how isolated Nihilus actually is, and it turns a vague condition into a strategic geography with a choke point you can fight over. And it reached backwards as well. The Vigilus material reframes Blackstone, which had existed in the setting since the Gothic War, since the Blackstone fortresses of much older editions, as something that can be polarized to attract or repel warp energy, which retroactively recasts Abaddon's entire behavior across the Gothic War as a knowledge-gathering exercise. He wasn't just seizing superweapons, he was learning what Blackstone does, and he has been seeding Blackstone constructs across the galaxy over successive Black Crusades ever since. I'd flag that as the closest thing to a genuine retcon in the campaign, and I'd also flag that I could not verify the exact wording in the book itself, only the wiki summaries of it. So the honest description is that Vigilus reinterpreted a 20-year-old storyline's motive. Not that Games Workshop announced it had changed its mind. There's a consequence of that idea I don't think gets discussed enough. If the gauntlet is held open by polarized Blackstone acting between two worlds, then the Imperium's access to half its own territory depends on a mineral formation staying where it is, not on a fleet, not on a fortress, on geology, and Abaddon's plan follows from that with unpleasant logic. He doesn't need to win a war on Vigilus, he needs to break some rock. The cyclonic torpedo bombardment that killed Cruel Daka also obliterated Silo the 15th of Thundersump on Mega Borealis and destroyed much of the Blackstone reserve stored there. And depending on how you read it, that strike did more strategic damage to the Imperium's position than anything the Black Legion achieved with an army. The most valuable thing on the planet was in a mining silo on a continent the Imperium had signed away to somebody else 1,000 years earlier. Watch how that idea behaves compared to everything else. The Speedwag has stayed an Orc war mode, Haarken has stayed a character, the Noctilith crown has stayed a terrain piece, but the gauntlet became the spine of the next several years of narrative. It's the corridor the whole Nachmund Rift war is fought over in 2022, and it's the strategic situation Abaddon is still trying to resolve when Arcs of Omen, Abaddon opens in January of 2023. The part of Vigilus that outlived Vigilus is the part with nothing to sell. Which brings us to how the war actually ends, and to the most interesting contradiction in these books. The climax is Abaddon's attempt to close the gauntlet, and it involves the strangest beat in the campaign. In the Vullian swirl, an artificially created vortex circling a Blackstone citadel, a cadre of the Fallen have been living for millennia. Abaddon parleys with one of them, a librarian called Osandus, who owes Abaddon a debt for helping him escape the Dark Angels during the Pandorex campaign. Osandus, reluctantly, fires an ancient gravitic weapon called the Voidclaw into the space between Vigilus and its moon Neovelum, creating a gravitic anomaly intended to reshape the corridor. The anomaly wreaks havoc on Imperial forces. It also begins draining the Vullian swirl itself, which is to say it starts destroying the people who fired it. Then Calgar challenges Abaddon at Saints Haven, and loses. Dracainen cuts him down. Before Abaddon can finish him, Haarken reports that the vengeful spirit is in danger, and Abaddon breaks off the kill to save his flagship. The threat to the ship came from an Eladia vessel, that detail I could only confirm from a single source, so treat the specifics as unverified. Abaddon withdraws. Calgar survives, grievously wounded, and runs the remainder of the war from an apothecarian bed. So who won? Vigilus ablaze, in 8th edition frames it bleakly. Abaddon withdrew, but Vigilus was never truly saved. Warzone Nachmund, Rift War, in 9th edition 3 years later, frames the same outcome as the Imperium holding firm and maintaining the Emperor's grip on Vigilus. Those two descriptions are not compatible in tone, and I'm not going to pretend one of them is the real one. The sources disagree. The war got more triumphant in retrospect. What's true in both versions is the strategic result. Abaddon failed. He set out to close the Nachmund Gauntlet and strand half the Imperium, and the corridor is still open. Vigilus is devastated. Ork warbands still hold the wastes. The pauper princes are still down there plotting, and chaos influence persists. But the door he came to shut is a door the Imperium still walks through. There's one more thing I should be honest about, which is how hard this material is to pin down. The books disagree with each other on basic facts. I spent a long time trying to establish something as simple as which settlement is the capital of Vigilus, and the sources genuinely conflict. Hyperia is described as the largest sprawl and the seat of the planetary government, and Saints Haven is described as the capital and the seat of the ruling dynasty. It's probably a distinction between an administrative capital and a dynastic one, but nobody says that. You're left to work it out. And there's a date in the background material for the Genestealer Cults' arrival that I found rendered as a string I couldn't verify as a real imperial dating convention at all, so I'm not going to read it out. It may well be a transcription error that has propagated. That's the state of the record on a campaign that ran across 6 books in 5 years. I mention this because it bears on the earlier point. The parts of Vigilus that are precisely documented are the parts with rules attached, the detachments, the units, the release dates. The parts that are muddled are the parts that were only ever prose, and then the books stop. After Arcs of Omen, Abaddon, in January of 2023, in which Abaddon meets Vashtor the Archiphane, strikes a pact, and turns his attention to the Baylor fleets and the Arcs of Omen, Vigilus effectively vanishes from the narrative. I could find no dedicated 10th edition Vigilus material. Games Workshop's attention moved to the Pariah Nexus and the Necron front. The final phase is worth noting for how quietly it happens. Warzone Nachmund. Rift War widens the conflict from the planet to the whole corridor and the neighbouring systems, with Haarken Worldclaimer leading the reaving of the gauntlet itself. Then Arcs of Omen. Abaddon opens with a line about Haarken's reaving and desperate victories on Vigilus and BL, and uses it as the reason Abaddon changes approach entirely, meeting Vashtor the Archiphane, striking a pact, and beginning work on the Baal fleets and the Space Hulk-cored warships called the Arcs of Omen. So Vigilus's last narrative function is to be the thing Abaddon gives up on. It isn't resolved. It's cited, once, as motivation for the next product line, which leaves a specific set of things that canon simply does not answer, and I'd rather list them as blanks than fill them in for you. Nobody knows what happened to Grandsire Worm. Kroldaka's death is recorded precisely, killed by a cyclonic torpedo bombardment that obliterated Silo the 15th of Thundersump on Mega Borealis, a strike that also destroyed much of the Blackstone reserve stored there. The Patriarch's fate is not recorded at all. Nobody knows what became of the Noctilith crowns, whether they were dismantled or left standing or are still out there corrupting the planet isn't stated. Nobody knows whether the Voidclaw permanently altered the orbit of Vigilus or its moon. The immediate havoc is described. The lasting astronomical consequence isn't. There's no figure for how many people died. Appalling is as specific as the books get, on a planet of hivesprawls. Those tyrannid hive fleets that were cited making for Vigilus never arrived, and were never explained. The Toho and the Necrons never appear at all, on a world the campaign insists is the most strategically valuable real estate in the galaxy. And the current state of Vigilus, as of 10th edition, is simply unnarrated. Not secret, not mysterious, just not written. That last one is the one I'd point at if somebody asked me to prove the argument in a single fact. A planet was established as the gate between the two halves of the Imperium, the strategic hinge of an entire era, the place where Abaddon came in person and lost. Then the edition changed, the product line moved to the Pariah Nexus, and the most important world in the galaxy stopped having a story. It didn't fall, it didn't hold, it stopped being scheduled. The gear I keep coming back to is the water. That detail about the nobility drinking melted polar ice while everyone else drinks reclaimed groundwater. It's in the first campaign book. It's specific. It's the kind of thing that tells you a person sat down and thought about what living on this planet would be like. And in 6 books across 2 editions, across an Ork invasion and a cult uprising, and the arrival of the despoiler himself, I cannot point you to the moment where the water matters. The Genestealer cult grows in the caverns, not the reservoirs. The fort walls get breached for racing routes, not aqueducts. The hollows are 5 enormous reservoirs with islands and processing infrastructure, and they are, as far as I can tell, scenery. The setting was better than the war that got fought on it. I think that's the honest summary of what Vigilus was. A genuinely inventive world, a genuinely excellent strategic premise, and a sequence of events on top of both that was shaped week by what was going on sale. Not cynically, not badly, just visibly. That man in the hobby shop was giving an accurate account of the Vigilus campaign. He listed the Orks, then the cults, then the new Marines on the neighbouring world, then Abaddon, and every one of those was a real thing that happened in the story, in that order, for stated in-universe reasons. He was also reading out a release calendar. Both of those were true at the same time, and only one of them was in the book.